Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians have managed to advance across the Shakhtarskyi River line towards the northern and northwestern flanks of Lyman as they continue to develop offensive operations towards the town from the northwestern, northeastern and eastern directions. Russians also continued advances in between that of Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk. The Russians have started storming Pokrovsk in the Shakhtarskyi district, where fighting is taking place in the first high-rise apartment complex buildings, as is located with some footage. The Russians also continued offensive operations along the border between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region, where the Ukrainians continued operations to counterattack in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, regaining control over some positions in that direction, as well as in the Zaporizhzhia region, where they continued counterattacks in the direction of the settlements captured by the Russians over the past few weeks and months. Starting out in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians started storming the Shakhtarskyi district in the southern parts of Pokrovsk. As we see with this located footage, the Russians have managed to enter into the first apartment complex buildings in the very southern outskirts of the Shakhtarskyi district. The fighting over the Shakhtarskyi district signals the beginning of a large battle that will take place over the southern parts of Pokrovsk, as the Ukrainians have already sent their reinforcements. The Russians storming the most defensible position of the Ukrainians within the Shakhtarskyi district signals that the Russians are looking to gain full control over the city and defeat the Ukrainian forces within it. What we're seeing is that the Battle of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, which are taking place with the Russians storming the eastern parts of Mirnorod and the southern parts of Pokrovsk, is a battle where the Ukrainians have sent their best forces to defend the city and the Russians are storming it directly. This is a similar case to the Battle of Bakhmut, where the Russians, mainly the Wagner forces, were storming the city and the Ukrainians were being flanked from both the northern and southern directions. In this case, the northern and western flanks. The Russians already have almost full control over the supply lines leading in and out of the city, with the Ukrainian forces fighting against the Russians directly along the front line. The Russians are working simultaneously to keep the Ukrainian forces within the pocket that is forming around the two cities, while attacking the flanks where the Russians also storming Rudinsky and Udashne in the western flank, where they will then gain control over the industrial area, which will allow them to cut off the E50 highway with either fire control or physically cutting it off. This will lead to the operational encirclement of the city, and then a push towards Hrishine from the northern and western flanks will allow the Russians to fully encircle both Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. The largest obstacle the Russians were facing with regards to the encirclement of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod was the northeastern flank, where the Ukrainians had a defensive line along the river line that covers the northeastern flank, as well as roads leading into Pokrovsk from the north, with additional roads located within the area between the river line and the highway. Even if the Russians were to gain physical control over Hrishine, they would only be operationally encircling the city, as the Ukrainians would still have many roads that they could pass through, and even at that it would not be a complete operational encirclement. Now that the Russians have gained control over all of these roads in between the river line and the highway, and now are fighting over the city that protects the highway for the Ukrainian forces, the Russians will be able to cut off the northern road completely. And with a push through the western flank, cutting off the western road completely is not unrealistic either, which will leave just Hrishine as the sole supply line for the Ukrainian forces. This means that the situation in Pokrovsk is almost at the part which Bakhmut was in during the later months of the siege of the city, around March and April. And the Russians are just a few locations, the industrial area here to the west and Rudinsky to the north, from achieving the situation which was Bakhmut at the end of the battle towards May. As we see the situation around Bakhmut at the start of May 2023 towards the end of the battle, the Ukrainians still had the road through Ivanivske, which can be comparable to the road through Hrishine, remaining under their control. The secondary road, the Khomova road, was under physical control by the Russian forces towards the end of the battle, which can be considered the Rodinsky road to the north. The Russians gained control over Rodinsky and gaining fire control over the E50 highway and Ryzhine will allow the Russians to repeat the situation of Bakhmut, but with Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. This is a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians, and the Russians storming the city of Pokrovsk and improving their positions on their flanks, as we've seen over the past few weeks, is a step closer to that situation. To the southwest, the Russians have managed to gain control of the border area near Horihova, gaining full control of the border all the way down towards Novokrainka, where the Ukrainians still have a small foothold across the border, and in the direction of Moravka, where the Ukrainians still control the settlement and the fortified position near it. The Ukrainians managed to regain full control over Zeleny High, and the Russian forces operating here to the south of the settlements have withdrawn back towards Novokhatsk and Tolstoy, following the Ukrainian counterattacks in the area to reorganize their positions to avoid an operational encirclement or dangerous position for their forces before restarting offensive operations. In the southwestern outskirts of the front line, the Ukrainians managed to regain some positions here within Stepove, regaining control over the intersection here in the western parts of the settlement. The Ukrainians have been attempting to regain their positions along Sherbaki towards Stepove, here along the main highway, ever since the Russians captured these settlements, where fighting has continued on the northern flanks of them. The Ukrainians regaining some positions there, and their recent counterattacks in the direction of Kamyansk shows their activity here in the Zaporizhzhia section is continuous and won't stop just because the Russians continue their own offensive operations. So we're seeing a lot of back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces as Russians look to gain control over the western outskirts of the Zaporizhzhia region, and the Ukrainians attempt to regain some of their lost positions. To the northeast of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to make some advances here in between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka. They continue their offensive operations towards Sofiivka, gaining control over some of the fortified positions, fighting over additional fortified positions, and breaking through the Ukrainian defensive areas here towards Mykolaiv on the western flank of Kostiantynivka. The Russians can completely bypass the Stepanivka, Tulfabelka, Rosyishne on the western flank of Kostiantynivka if they're able to push through the open fields towards Mykolaiv and gain control over that, to then pressure the supply lines of the Ukrainians on the rear of Kostiantynivka, and gaining fire control of the highway between Kostiantynivka and Roskivka. And with the push generation of Sofiivka as well, the Russians can advance along the road between Pokrovsk towards Roskivka to reach the outskirts of Roskivka even further west of Kostiantynivka. What we're seeing is that the Russians are slowly developing offensive operations in the vicinity of Chasiv Yar. A push along the railway all the way towards Kramatorsk from the southern flank will allow the Russians to gain an operational encirclement of not just Kostiantynivka, but also Drushkivka all the way to the southern flank of Kramatorsk, by a combined push along the northern and western flanks of Kostiantynivka. And what we are seeing is that the Russians are not just repeating the Bakhmut scenario for Pokrovsk and Mirnorod in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region, but also for Kostiantynivka and Roskivka for a similar case as the Bakhmut-Chasiv Yar scenario. Further north along the Serebets River line, the Russians continued offensive operations on the western flank of Mirne, gaining control over additional forest lines south of Kolotyasi. Following the capture of the town, the Russians are slowly developing the offensive operations towards the rear of Sarishne, and with the offensive operations by the Russians within Sarishne in the eastern parts, a flanking maneuver from the north, cutting off one of the supply routes, and gaining an additional push towards gaining a foothold within the northern parts of the town will allow the Russians to speed up the capture of Sarishne, which will create a additional crossing across the Serbia river line for the Russians towards Sarishne, establishing a additional logistical hub for their forces in the area across the Serbia river line, and developing offensive operations towards Lyman by bypassing some of the fortified positions, by pushing towards Sarishne, going around the fortifications, and then pushing from Sarishne towards Stavki, bypassing the fortifications from the east. At the same time, the Russians continued offensive operations within Sarishne, gaining control over some positions to the west of the settlement and along the road, gaining fire control and physical control over the road leading into Lyman from the northwest. This limits the supply routes into Lyman from the northwest from 3 separate roads to 2 separate roads through Novoselivka and Yarova. This, combined with their offensive operations to the north and to the east, the Russians are slowly getting closer to a siege of Lyman, getting control over Lyman to the north, a push from Chasiv Yar to the north in the eastern flank of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk to encircle the Ukrainian positions along Siversk, and a push from the center between Kościantynivka and Pokrovsk towards Tereshkivka, Kościantynivka, and Kramatorsk from the west, will allow the Russians to start the siege over the Slovyansk-Kościantynivka line from the northern, eastern, southern, and western directions, leaving just a few roads in and out of the Slovyansk-Kościantynivka line, not enough to fully supply their forces along the entire defensive line. What we're seeing is that the Russians are taking full advantage of their numerical superiority over the Ukrainians by attacking several sectors of the front line at once. While the Ukrainians counterattack, they simply pull back, allowing the Ukrainians to capture some positions while striking them with artillery and FPV drones before counterattacking once they detect weaknesses within the Ukrainian positions. This pressures the Ukrainians to constantly be on the move, while at the same time the Russians will always be able to outnumber the Ukrainian forces in areas where they are launching offensive operations, because in areas where the Ukrainians send their reinforcements, they simply move to the defense. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.